Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Please take your seats and settle down. We are about to begin this evening's program, and as a mark of respect to our distinguished panelists, please do put your phone on silent mode. It is customary at our events that we first greet our dignitaries on the dais with flowers. As I announce your names, please rise and accept a bouquet from IFA founder, Ambassador, and President Surinder Kumar. Ambassador Shyam Saran. Shri Ajay Shankar. Dr. Sunita Narayan. Professor Bharat Desai. As the discussion is a collaboration between IFA and India Habitat Center, Ambassador Bhaswati Mukherjee is the co-host and not a guest. But Ambassador Surinder Kumar will like to greet her with a bouquet as the first woman president of India Habitat Center. Be honored, ma'am. Now I invite Ambassador Surinder Kumar to make his welcome and introduction remarks. Over to Ambassador Kumar.
Thank you, Himangi ji. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome to you all on this very warm evening on a discussion on global warming and climate change. The fact that you are here shows that climate change and global warming matter to you. Our special thanks are due to our eminent panel comprising Ambassador Shyam Saran, who chairs discussion this evening, Sri Ajay Shankar, Dr. Sunita Narayan, and Professor Bharat Desai. We must also thank India Habitat Center, co-hosts for the program, and Tata Steel, who have supported our endeavors. I would like to recognize Mr. Manish Mishra of Tata Steel. Now, I'm delighted to have amidst us our dear friend, Ambassador Bhaswati Mukherjee, who has taken over as the first woman president of India Habitat Center. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a big hand to Ambassador Bhaswati Mukherjee. What a coincidence. The chairman of our discussion this evening is Ambassador Shyam Saran, who took over as the president, as the chairman of the IIC, International Center, last year. And as you all know, our current EM, who has given more quotable quote than anybody else, is also from our fraternity, who said diplomats don't deliver. A word about our panel. It is not only eminent, but also brings together experts from diverse fields. Ambassador Shyam Saran is a former Foreign Secretary and a former Special Envoy Prime Minister on Climate Change and Nuclear Deal. He has served as chairman of RIS and National Security Advisory Board and is a fellow at CPR and the Institute of Chinese Studies and a life trustee of IIC. He has been writing on climate change issues frequently. He wrote an opinion piece just last week. After a successful inning in the prestigious IAS, where he rose to be Secretary of Department of Industrial Policy and Promotion, Ajay Shankar has worn various hats at various stages in his illustrious career and is presently a distinguished fellow at TERI. Dr. Sunita Narayan, currently Director General of the Environment and Science Center, is a renowned environmentalist who is known for voicing her independence views without fear and malice. She never minces words, and you can provoke her at your own peril. She has participated in IFA discussions on climate change, both virtual and physical. 4 years back in the same hall, she was so fiercely critical of the US that the Minister of Environment from American Embassy, Josh Sibley, who was a co-panelist, told me at the end of discussion, what an incredible experience. I felt as if I had put my head in the mouth of a lion. And we are happy to have on our panel for the first time, Professor Bharat Desai, who is Professor of Law and Chairperson of the Center of International Legal Studies at the JNU. I'm sure we will benefit immensely from his legal expertise, and he will provide perspective, legal perspective, the global discourse on climate change. Not long ago, an American president reportedly said when the temperature dipped to -3 in Washington, global warming, where are you? He didn't think global warming, climate change were real and walked away from the Paris Climate Change Agreement. Mercifully, his successor resorted to immediate course correction after election and brought his country back in the leadership role in the global discourse and made bold pledges in Glasgow of reducing US carbon emission by 50 to 52% by 2030 and net zero by 2050. Indian Prime Minister Sri Narendra Modi also made ambitious announcement in COP26 Glasgow of producing 50% energy amounting to 500 gigawatt from renewable sources, reducing the GDP intensity by 40%, reducing carbon emission 1 billion ton by 2030, and net zero by 2070. COP27 Sharm el-Sheikh will be remembered for agreement on creating for the first time a loss and damage fund for the most vulnerable countries. I'm told African countries voice favor of carbon market partnership, and I'm told at Bali G20 summit, there was some idea floated for just energy transition partnership. But the pledges made by developed countries for annual contribution of US $100 billion for climate finance has yet to be met. Some experts feel the development of and deployment and dissemination of green technologies, especially carbon capturing, carbon storing technologies, adequate finance is a must. But the moot point of common but differentiated responsibilities for global warming still remains on the table. Obviously, the developed countries led by US, where per capita emission is far higher, and who have already used 75% of carbon space in the atmosphere, don't want to own their past misdeeds and want to press the countries like India to drastically reduce their carbon emission, which is bound to impact their developmental agenda. Recently, the UNSG urged the developed countries to bring forward their net zero commitments to 2040 and ask countries like India to advance their goal by a decade. And the report of the IPCC has set the alarm bell ringing by announcing that we might breach the crucial threshold of temperature rise of 1.5 degree by 2030 itself, 2030s. I have just scratched the surface. I am not an environment specialist, and I hope the experts on the dais will share their honest and dispassionate views on the theme of discussion and enlighten the audience. I must clarify, IFA aims to educate public opinion. We never follow Chatham rules. Everything is on the record. If you scratch your nose or you give a dirty look, that is very much being recorded, and you might be answerable to. So be careful what you are doing. Now I hand over the proceedings to Ambassador Samson, a dear friend and a neighbor and an expert on environment. Over to you, Sham.
Thank you very much, my friend Surinder Kumar, founder president of IFA. I also would like to welcome on this panel Shri Ajay Shankar, my colleague, former Secretary, Government of India, and currently distinguished fellow at TERI. Another old friend, Dr. Sunita Narayan, Director General of the Center for Science and Environment. Professor Bharat Desai, whom I have not had the pleasure of meeting earlier, but I have seen some of his work when it was announced that he would be on the panel. Professor of International Law and Chairperson of the Center for Legal Studies, JNU. So I must compliment my friend and colleague, Ambassador Surinder Kumar and IFA, for taking the initiative to convene this panel discussion on climate change. Of course, the title is somewhat provocative. Are we anywhere near averting climate change disaster? If you ask me, no, we are not. We are probably headed into climate change disaster. So I think, if one has to really talk about, are there ways still left to deal with this looming crisis? In fact, this crisis is already unfolding in front of our eyes. Surinder made a reference to the IPCC report, and the 6th assessment report came out only recently. And in the summary which is there for policymakers, there is this very important paragraph which says, quote, "Climate change is a threat to human well-being and planetary health. There is a rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. The choices and actions implemented in this decade will, in fact, have impacts now and for thousands of years." That's the IPCC. By the way, it is very important to really understand that the IPCC is really, some of the foremost scientists from all across the world. And what they say in this report is consensus. That is the consensus view, which is, people have different interpretations, different views, but this is a consensus view of the IPCC in a summary which is meant for policymakers. So essentially what the IPCC is telling policymakers is, there is no time left. If you have to do something, you have to do it now. Of course, if the window is closing, then that means, as again the IPCC says, you have to make very rapid and very deep cuts in emissions if we are to actually avoid this disaster. As I said, we are already in the midst of an unfolding disaster, but if it is going to, if we are trying to prevent it from getting worse, those deep cuts, policy action must be taken now. And as you delay this further, the extent, the scope of the action you have to take to avoid disaster, that also keeps increasing. So it's not a steady state solution. I mean, it's something that you have to take into account the dynamics of this particular challenge. So if we have to make rapid and deep cuts, then obviously the transition which has to be made, which is absolutely critical in terms of climate change, that you have to make an energy transition. That means you have to move from a pattern of economic development, which is essentially based on fossil fuels, oil, gas, coal. You have to move from that to a pattern of economic activity, which is progressively based more and more on renewable sources of energy and also cleaner sources of energy, like nuclear energy, for example. So this transition every country has to make. Now, if you have to make, therefore, very deep, urgent cuts, it means that this transition has to be accelerated. The other issue is, if you have to make this transition, it is not costless. Sometimes you see the kind of narrative from the West is, it's in your own interest. You should make this transition because this is actually very cost effective. This is actually economically, it is going to be good for you. Ultimately, yes, but making that transition, I have to expend lots of resources. And the more accelerated this transition is, the higher the scale of resources that we require. So that is another thing that you have to think about. Surinder said $100 billion has been promised for a long time. We still haven't seen many pennies coming out of that. The last point that I would like to make here is that today we have come to a point where you cannot look at climate change just as a singular domain. What has really happened is that climate change has become now interlinked with what is happening in other domains. So you have, for example, the link between, climate change and biodiversity. This is something which even now, IPCC itself recognizes. So it says, for example, that if we are looking at, the interconnections, then what we have come to understand now is that there is an interdependence of climate, ecosystems, and biodiversity and human societies. All these are interlinked. So any intervention that you make on climate change, can't be just on climate change. It is linked to all these things together. So in terms of, India has come out with, I think, a very far-sighted initiative of life, looking at how there has to be a value system change. There has to be a lifestyle change. That is fundamental. Now, if that has to be done, then of course, we have to take into account how do we make it possible for us to have this kind of intervention across the board. And that is where the fundamental principle of equity comes in. You have to have equitable burden sharing. If this is a global issue, it requires global collaboration. That collaboration will only come if it is based on the principle of equity. And what we really have to understand is, and this is where I will end, what we have to understand is that our emissions are survival emissions. Emissions in the West, in the industrialized world, are lifestyle emissions. There is a fundamental difference. Here it is a matter of survival. And this is the message which does not seem to get across to the rest of the world. And we have to shout loud and clear to get this message across. So that's my opening remarks. What I will do is I will structure this discussion along the following lines. One, I will ask Professor Desai, because we are looking at the legal issues as well, and he's a legal expert. My sense is that while we are talking about the urgency of this issue, the urgency of this challenge, actually, if we look at the legal evolution, we have moved from a rather strong climate change regime, which is the UNFCCC, followed by the Kyoto Protocol, which had, legal commitments for emission reductions. And if you did not meet those, then you had a very strict compliance procedure. So you have moved from a legal basis for climate change action, and where the principle of equity was central to that UNFCCC, we have moved to what is essentially a pledge and review system, a voluntary system. If you don't meet the targets you yourself put forward as your national determined contributions, nothing can be done to you. Somebody can complain about it, somebody can criticize you about it, but there is no legal sanction. So my sense is that as the enormity of the problem has increased, as far as the legal response to it is concerned, it has moved from a strong climate change regime to a very weak regime. And what does that mean? And perhaps in that context, if you could just talk about, the recent reference which has been made to the International Court of Justice about, the responsibility of states for the damage which is caused by climate change. Then I will move to Sunita, and who has been very much closely associated with this entire challenge of climate change, very familiar with what is happening in India, what is not happening in India. So perhaps she can give us a sense that in the context of this global challenge that we are facing, where does India locate itself? And what are the ways in which, not only in terms of addressing the international challenge, but also this is something whether there is a pressure on us or not pressure on us, there are things which we need to do in any case. So how do we bring about that? And lastly, I mentioned about the energy transition. That is fundamental. You cannot have an answer to climate change unless you make that energy transition. And I think Ajay is very, very well placed because of his experience, to really address that issue. Because I also feel that this transition period is in fact a period of great risk, where both systems, the fossil fuel system as well as the renewable system, these are running in parallel. And unless this is managed very carefully, very methodically, you may end up with major disruptions in your energy security, which again may cause a kind of a setback to what we are trying to do to meet the challenge of climate change. So that is how I will structure the discussion, if that is okay with our panelists. And so thank you very much for your attention. And I would now request Professor Desai to perhaps make his intervention. I have been told by Surinder, who's a very hard taskmaster, I had to persuade him not to use the buzzer to tell people that their 8 to 10 minutes are over. But even though the buzzer will not be there, I will have to raise my hand. If I'm not going to raise my hand, he will raise his hand. Bharat, you have the floor. Thank you.
Fine. Good evening to everyone, and it's a pleasure and privilege for me to be here in this heart of the city. I rarely venture out of my forested campus, almost like what the Asiatic lions they do from the Gir forest. I rarely venture out. I have seen the things from here, both working in a civil society group in a building across the road here, and work with the part of the official Indian delegation for almost 7 to 8 years or so, where I used to literally interact with Sunita and all those fisty climate activists. And of course, so having seen everything, I thought, like my father always used to say, ki, muthi band karo, ghar pakdo, and wait for the time. Okay? And do your, dig in your heels and do your work. That is exactly what I went back and did, because I learned very hardcore things, that what was at work. As a student of international law, because I have a larger mosaic which I covered about this entire approach of global problems need global solutions. Are they global? Do they need global solutions? Does it work? These are the things, the things have come back to haunt you, what Ambassador, both Shyam Saran and Ambassador Surinder Kumar have mentioned. It's almost now, this is let me chronologically briefly, because I have to cover 30 years period, 3 conventions within 10 minutes. So I hope I'll be able to do justice, If I go back there, I almost literally grown with the evolution of the climate convention. I remember, probably very few people will recall the very pioneering work done by both Sunita Narayan and Anil Agarwal, the global warming in an unequal world. That is exactly how the thing started, The whole picture which was emerging, that what was at work. In an unequal world, you are trying to bulldoze something, And we have seen the conventions after conventions, There are more than 300 global conventions. I have a full monograph, Cambridge monograph on multilateral environmental agreements. I've seen the secretariat, how they work from within, the huge amount of funding, the proliferation of agreements, everything. And I bring you back to on 2nd of June 2022, when the 50th United Nations Secretary General walked into the Stockholm Convention Center, and he posed questions to the heads of state, heads of government. He said, please rescue us. Please save us from the brink, We are running out of time. And he spoke about the triple planetary crisis, which covered climate change, biological diversity, and pollution and hazardous waste. This is something part of the small menu which you are talking about, And it appears that there were no takers. Stockholm plus 50 conference I'm literally talking about. And that also coincided, that date, 4th of June was the 30th anniversary of the date when the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change opened for signature in New York. So 30 years are over, and that was the task, I thought from a scholarly domain, I thought let me go back to the drawing board and pose some questions. I reached out to the global audience. I have a journal, this is the platform which, as the editor-in-chief of the Environmental Policy and Law Journal, published from Netherlands, Amsterdam. So I asked the people, invited them to write, their additional contributions about, the question which I posed to them was, what went wrong? What went wrong? 30 years. And let me briefly mention about the very nature of the animal which we are talking about. It's a sector-based regulatory instrument. The aim is to stabilization of greenhouse gas emissions at a level which will prevent the dangerous anthropogenic emissions, not to interfere with the climate system. That is the objective. And this convention was supposed to be rolled back once the objective is over. 30 years are over. You are nowhere. as Ambassador Shamsaran mentioned, 1992, the first framework convention, it was a framework convention. You had to put the flesh and bones into the convention. It took a long time. So we went there, and I thought I'll mention briefly the architecture, that what went into the convention, the UN Framework Convention. I recall here very pioneering contribution made by India's, I would say that fisty diplomat, Dr. Chandrasekhar Dasgupta. I had the privilege of hobnobbing with him, along with Dr. Pradipta Ghosh and even Manjeev Puri. I've seen those, how much really, they had the passion about the holding on to the basic architecture of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And as we lower the guard, as we literally slip from it, whatever were the reasons, one doesn't need to go there, I've seen the argument, I was part of that whole argument, and gradually the whole threshold was, I'm referring to the principle of common but differential responsibility and the respective capability. That everybody is responsible. It was to be in a staggered manner. You came first, you do it first, we will do it later. We never denied that. Question was that Article 4 of the convention spoke about the developed countries taking the lead in reducing the global climate emissions. And a process was supposed to be put into place to work out the characteristics or elements to decide whether the developed countries are taking the lead or not. And I remember in my note given to the Minister of Environment and Forest, 2005, 2006, a detailed elaborate note. What I said was it's a conditioned precedent. The responsibility of the developing countries is dependent upon the fulfillment of responsibility by the developed countries. Have you done it? And I suggested that we need to put in process a kind of a mechanism whereby you can catch hold of them. Elements of a UNFCCC process could have been put in. That never came. I do not know the reasons, but that would have given us the thing. So it opened the front because everybody, they were troubled that this was the master stroke. The principle of common but differential responsibility and the principle of equity. It was a master stroke. And they were perturbed, and that actually forced them to move to the Kyoto Protocol, which was the exclusive responsibility of the developed countries to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. It was unprecedented in the legal annals. Never ever the developed countries were pushed to the corner to that extent. And they saw it, And immediately the whole project started about, downgrading the principle, because unless you attack that main fundamental principle, you cannot renege from it. You cannot walk out of it, And so you can see by the time few years, the same legendary Al Gore went to, who came out with his inconvenient truth, spoke about, went and withdrew, the United States withdrew, de-signed the Kyoto Protocol. This was again unprecedented. Never ever in the legal annals a country had withdrew the signature. You cannot withdraw the signature. You can refuse to ratify. They wanted to be part of, out of it. George Bush said, why should I, if I can manage with $40 billion, why should I put my country to spend $400 billion? That was a classical legal position. By that, before anybody realized Kyoto was dead. They said, Kyoto is dead, long live the Kyoto Protocol. It was a clinical breach of a legally binding agreement, and everybody connived into it. So the process started about bringing down the principle of, because you have to wriggle out of that Kyoto, that common but differential responsibility, to bring you, because the effort was to bring developing countries at par. And we are not at par. You can only treat, equals equally. When people are not equal, when the principle of equity is at work, when you are not responsible for primarily causing the problem, why should you pay for the sins which you never committed? This is that famous one Chinese delegate had said, that you put some money on the table and let us talk business. So that gradually went, and as the rest is a story, the Paris Accord came by that time, as Ambassador Shamsaran said, gradual downgrading from the legally binding architecture to the voluntary commitments. हम बराबर है, when आप बराबर नहीं है. So how do you hold the developing countries responsible? And ground realities are ominous. Most of the developing countries, they have a massive poverty, malnutrition, energy crisis, huge amount of those things, And you now put, and I think someday probably, hopefully, Center for Science and Environment or some other, I think, NGO will need to do the work, the ozone story, that when we were trapped into the ozone story, all those ODS, ozone depleting substances were to be phased out. Initially we were doled out with some money under the multilateral fund, ozone depletion, etc. We never realized. They thought this ODS have to go, and gradually the entire economy had to, geared up that. I do not know how much money India alone could, ended up spending. How much money we got? Multilateral fund had a very peanuts. Most of the multilateral funds, if you talk, I have studied about 100 multilateral funds, the money simply refuses to come out, including the Global Environment Facility. More money you put, nothing comes out of it. So that is a big challenge that you are facing, So, so far as the Paris Agreement is concerned, again, the whole principle of voluntarism. The language is not shall, aim to, encourage, those things are there. And the ambition as a legal concept has been injected into the Paris Agreement. Ambition, that you gradually raise the bar. कहते हैं अभी और आप हिम्मत कर लीजिए, थोड़ा और कोशिश कर लीजिए, थोड़ा और आगे बढ़ जाइए. And here, this is exactly where the game is at work. And I had the chance to, interact with, briefly after, India's, ambassador, former ambassador T.S. Tirumurti, after he demoted his office in New York, he wrote an article in The Hindu, and I realized that what he was talking about, he spoke about the backtracking from the climate commitments, And I tried, it was a Herculean task for me to get his email ID. And I tracked him. And from Chennai, I wrote to him, and he said, I have never written an article in my career. I said, please, and so I invited him to write an article, and he wrote a beautiful article. It's part of this volume, backtracking on climate action, reflections of a negotiator. It's a beautiful account where he gives the telltale account of the story about the 22nd of July 2022, when 10 countries came out with a statement, asking the developed countries to properly put the things into place, And his premise is that on most of the issues, $100 billion, all those stories, that money is nowhere in sight, the technology is nowhere in sight, most of the commitments which the developed countries have made, they have been backtracking, You never walk the talk. Promise तो किया था ना क्या साहब, मैंने तो ऐसे promise कर दिया था, आप क्यों मान लेते हो हमें? So you are actually tricked into the whole game, कि पैसा अभी आएगा, just wait for it, अभी आ जाएगा. We're actually tricked, but this is nothing new about it. Right from the time the Stockholm Conference, when the then Indian Prime Minister went to Stockholm and she was pleading before the Stockholm audience, saying, how can I ask my people, not to pollute when their lives are contaminated with the source? For you, it is a matter of luxury. For it's a question of survival. Money has never flown. Technology has never come. The entire kind of the segregation has been continuing for over 50 years. And I raised this same question, when I had a webinar on the issue, saying that what went wrong? 50 years are over. When you look back, this entire huge global regulatory regime you put into place, institutional paraphernalia you create, trillions of dollars you spent. Why did the global environment continue to deteriorate? And it was nothing surprising that the UNEP executive director, Inger Anderson, when she went to the conference venue, she said, if Indira Gandhi and Olof Palme were alive, we see them, what answer we will give to them, And she says, we'll be embarrassed. They said,
Professor, you will have to...
So I'll just wind up here. So I think these are the issues, seminal issues which are part of this thing. We shall have to grapple with them. We shall have to go through the drawing board and grapple with them, find answers. And India matters, because India, with that big size, 1/5 of the global population, one of the fastest growing economy, people look to you. You have to settle, because here is primarily an ideational battle. It's a battle of ideas. It's not a bureaucratic game. You have to play the idea. You ought to have the scholars on board, because I've seen that from within, how much you lack. You do not know basic things, Somebody said, Copenhagen Accord, हम तो करके आ गए, आप बताइए कि हमने क्या करके आए हैं. Copenhagen Accord करके हम आ गए हैं. So we need to know the animal. And finally, when we speak about this entire, what is actually happening with the regime, gradually it's basically floundering. The regime is floundering after 30 years or so. Nowhere is heading. You still, it's an endless battle which is going on. A conference of party after conference of party will take place. This year it will take place in Dubai, in
Professor
United Arab
Desai,
Emirates.
we
And
will have no time for Q&A,
I'll just
please.
wind up, finally, the reference, which is again a very interesting development by the United Nations General Assembly on 29th of March, passed a resolution. 12th of April, the Secretary General moved a letter to the President of the International Court of Justice, Johan Donog, asking for an advisory opinion. It's an advisory opinion. It's an advisory opinion. The International Court of Justice simply can say no. Advisory is an advisory. You may not give the opinion. It's basically to find out the legal obligations of the state so far as the climate things are concerned. You already have it laid down in the 3 conventions that the court is supposed to do. Second part is that in case the countries by act or omission fail, what will follow, for instance.
Professor, please, now close it.
And finally, so if that remains to be seen, if the court refuses to answer, that is one scenario. And second is...
I wish I had brought my buzzer.
Court gives the answer, that you will see what the General Assembly will accept or not. Thank you. Sorry.
Yeah, I think Surinder has his buzzer somewhere. Yeah. No, I think, Professor, thank you very much for your intervention, because I think it is important to understand that, as I mentioned, that we have moved from what is a fairly strong legal regime to one which is essentially just pledge and review. And I'm not very sure that this reference to the ICJ will really have much of an impact. Reason why I'm concerned about the advisory opinion being sought is because, again, it makes no distinction with respect to the responsibilities of developed states and developing states. The issue of historical responsibility, which was very much acknowledged in the UNFCCC, that historical responsibility aspect has in fact been completely sidelined. And I think it is very important for India, if those sittings are going to be held in the ICJ, that some of those elements which have been, camouflaged in a sense, those are brought back, because I think going forward, the equity issue will become even more important than it is today. So thank you very much for highlighting those aspects. Now I turn to Sunita, who's been in the trenches for quite some time, and is probably one of the most important, climate warriors that we have had in India.
I'm not sure.
I had the
Given
privilege
the state of climate change, it's not good to be seen
I
as a
have
climate
had the
warrior.
privilege
Failed.
of working together with her when I was special envoy for climate change, and I'm very deeply grateful to her, because during that particular period, she was really a pillar of support. So I'm very happy to give her the floor to share some of her perspectives with us. You have the floor, Sunita.
Thank you, Shyam, and actually the pleasure is mutual. When you were climate envoy, I think it was a it was a privilege to work with you. So thank you very much for that. Let me quickly firstly recap a few things that we have heard today, so that we are all at speed on certain issues. And then let's move forward to see where do we go? Where do we go as a world? Where do we go as India? First, I think it's very clear it is an existential threat. I think on that, there should be absolutely no doubt. The second is we are victims. And let us also be clear that the impact of climate change is not about the future, it is happening today. When I was in Rio, I was very young at that time. I call it always the age of innocence, when we were all there and George Bush was flying in, and we actually thought that the world could be changed. But at that time, climate change was way ahead. I mean, it was a model of scientists which were predicting that we would see extreme weather events. Today, we are seeing it in our world, and it's only going to get worse. We are at 1.1, 1.2 degrees centigrade rise from the pre-industrial period to now, or the post-industrial period to now. We are definitely headed to 1.5 degrees. Now, if at 1.1 degrees centigrade rise, you see what you're seeing today, let's please be very clear that this is about an existential threat, nothing less. CSC last year, we put together what are the extreme weather events in India from the 1st of January to the 30th of September. All we did was to do a deep dive into the IMD database, because IMD classifies every event as extreme or not extreme. And you will not believe when I tell you that we've had one extreme weather event a day, between the 1st of January to the 30th of September. Okay? That was last year when we did the analysis. This year's data will be out very soon. We did it for COP, so that's why 30th of September. The fact is, you and I are protected. I mean, if it's extreme heat wave, we can still crank up our ACs. And Shyam, you really need to lose that tie for being climate appropriate weather, okay? But the fact is, the impact on the poor in the world, who are worst impacted because of climate change, is a human face that we don't recognize. And that is really the tragedy also of the global negotiation. So I just want to put that at rest, that let's not at all underestimate the scale of the devastation which is unfolding in front of us. The second thing that Shyam said, that Bharat said, and I just want to reiterate it, is that climate change is about a political failure in the world, a global political failure, because this is one issue on which self-interest of countries cannot work. We need global cooperation, because you're dealing with global commons. If one country polluted in the past, the other country will pollute in the future. And the only way you can deal with this is through a cooperative agreement. And cooperation is built on the principle of equity, which is why the issue of equity, climate justice, is not a moral issue. It is actually intrinsic to getting an ambitious and effective climate agreement. The fact of the matter today is 70% of the world does not have access to development even now. And by 2030, the world would have exhausted, please hear this carefully, the world would have exhausted the entire carbon budget to keep us below 1.5 degrees centigrade. Okay? That's when 70% of the world does not have access to development. That's the scenario today. Okay? So we have to understand, now there's one way to look at it is to say 70% doesn't matter, they can just go drown in the ocean. But they will develop. They will use, however you may put pressure to say we will not fund coal-based power plants in Africa, but they will be development. They will emit. They are human. They will need to grow. And as they grow, they're going to put in more and more emissions into that same atmospheric space, and that is the jeopardy that we are in. That's why equity and justice has to be part of an agreement. That's why what Shyam said, the rule-based system of the 1992, which was based on we will go first, we will reduce, the countries which have not emitted will have the right to development, but that development will need to be done differently, for which they will get money and technology. That was the agreement. Okay? Now that has been reneged, and we've heard it from our two esteemed panelists. That is now over. Paris Agreement erased any principle of equity. Just imagine, many of you are diplomats, just imagine a preamble of a global international agreement that says climate justice is important for some. That's what the preamble says. I mean, how can justice be important for some? It was a sop for countries like us, but how does that work? Now that's really the state in which the world is today. Now, when I say 70%, please understand I include China in the 30%. Now this is why the concept of a rule-based system is so important. Because when you make rules for all. And if you look at all other global agreements, and many of you, I'm sure, have been architects of many of the global agreements, they've always had provisions, if it is rule-based, that as you increase your emissions, you move from one category to another. It's based on equality. Today we have a situation where everybody, it's a pledge and review. Do what you can, as much as you can. And everybody has accepted that all the pledges on the table do not add up to keeping us below 1.5 degrees centigrade. All the pledges on the table are on track for a 3-degree minimum temperature rise. So what good is that global agreement? Now that's really where we need, as countries of the South, to step back and do two things. And that's where I want to take this discussion, what happens now. One, we need very clearly to make sure that the principle of equity is back on the table. G20 is one opportunity where the government of India, we have a unique opportunity because this is a forum, unlike G7, which is one group of countries. G20 includes countries like Brazil, South Africa, India. We can make sure that the G20 puts the issue of equity at the core of climate agreements going forward. We must not lose track of that principle, not only because it is of interest to us, because bringing equity, bringing a rule-based system back means that you get a more effective, ambitious agreement as you move forward. Okay? The second thing that I think is very important is to call a spade a spade. I think I'm pretty old now, but I have decided to get old and stay where I am and continue to do what I do, which is to call a spade a spade. Today, the world is in a situation where we are rolling back a lot of the agreements that we've had on decarbonizing, on moving out of fossil fuels. If all of you have seen the G7 statement just yesterday, which came out of Japan, there's a very clear sort of reading of the statement that says LNG is now going to stay because we need it. Coal is not going to be abated because we need it. Now, how does the world tell the rest of the world, including countries like us, to get out of coal when, given a crisis, coal gets a longer life? LNG is something that they need. So I think it is important for us to bring equity again in that, because as I have been arguing, LNG is needed for us. We need it to deal with our local air pollution. We need gas, and that's something I'm very clear about, even though I know Ajay will say, why do you talk about gas when you should only talk about renewables? But for me, as an Indian environmentalist, we need gas because we need to move out of polluting sources which are harming our bodies. So what then does India do? And that's really what Shyam's task to me was. I'll use the few minutes that are left to talk about that. I think for us, environment and climate change needs to now be seen as an issue in which we need to come up with what are the best pathways for us to move ahead. There is no doubt that if we were to look at the issue of, let's say, I'll give you two examples, maybe three. Let's say the issue of Delhi's air pollution, something that Kamalji is sitting here. We've known each other on that issue for so long. We have discussed it. And the issue of local air pollution. Now, we know it's all about two major, you can talk about dust and all the rest if you want to distract yourself. But the essential two reasons why we cannot breathe is because of poor combustion. Poor combustion because of the use of coal, particularly in a very large numbers of furnaces that we have around the city, and combustion in the vehicles that we have on the road, which continue to grow and grow and grow. We build more roads, we build more flyovers, and then vehicles fill them up. And as a result of it, our lungs are choked. Now, the answers for both of them are actually good for climate. On one hand, Delhi has banned coal in Delhi and in a 100-kilometer around the radius of Delhi. We have closed our last coal-based power plant because of the reason that we need to be able to do so. We need to find answers out of coal. Now, there is no way, and I have argued, and I know Ajay will take this issue as he discusses the energy transition. I don't think we can shift the burden of transition out of coal on countries like India, because the rest of the world has used coal till now for their development. You cannot tell countries like India to phase out coal. But what you can tell countries like India, and what you can work with us with huge money and financing, is to make sure that the growth of energy is not in coal. Because unlike the rest of the world, we need to grow. We are not countries which have reached the peak level when it comes to energy consumption. We will double between now and 2030. That doubling can come out of non-coal sources, but that requires financing, and that's what we need to put on the table. We need to put on the table the need for a public transport transformation in our cities. We need to put on the table the fact that we will build more and more housing, but it is in our interest to make sure that those housing that we built are thermal comforted housing, which does not mean that you first build badly and then you fix expensive air conditioning and you have Saint-Gobain and everyone else telling you about double insulated glass. But you actually use every principle of passive architecture to build well. So we can do a lot of that. We have just completed a report on the steel sector, on the iron and steel sector, suggested a pathway how we can accelerate our decarbonization. And we can do that in a way that we can double our steel production, but we can do that with less emissions than we have even today. Okay? Now and that's the big but, that when I talk about climate change transformations and I talk about the solutions on the table, it does require financing. And that's what we need to put on the table. We need to put on the table the need for energy access. We have large numbers of women today who still use dirty biomass to cook their food. Today, the only reason the earth is not fried is because you have so many poor people who are not in the fossil fuel energy system. But the option is that they can actually leapfrog, but that requires financing. And that's where, and I would like to end with this, Shyam, that I think that's the opportunity today. What I find today is that this one opportunity that is there, and it's a small one, it's a small window, as IPCC says, but today the finance discussion has moved beyond climate. It's moved beyond talking about $100 billion and the need for more financing. It's into seriously, today there are discussions which are linking the issue of debt relief, the issue of concessional finance, the issue of multilateral bank reform, to the issue of the transformation we need in the world. Now, I know, and unfortunately, the system is so well organized that the same people who created the problem are always given the job to find a way out of it, okay? And that's always a status quoist, shuffle the deck a little bit so that we feel that we are doing something, but we really should not do anything approach. But I think today, the revenge is really of nature, and the clock is ticking. So whether we want to shuffle the deck and pretend that we are moving when we are really not moving, that's really a choice that we have. And it's a choice that sadly, if we keep making, we are really going to be a generation that is going to be indicted for the fact that we lost the opportunity, we lost the time, we squandered away all the things that we could have done, and we are really in making sure that as each moment goes on, things are only going to get worse and much worse. So my real hope is that we will, for once, make sure that even if it's a sweet solution, we will take the rude answer and move on. Thank you.
Thank you, Sunita. You lived up to your billing as calling a spade a spade. So I think we are very grateful for you to really set the record straight in this sense. Let me just make the point that when you talked about calling a spade, I think we continue to be in denial, a collective denial. For example, I read the whole aspect of net zero. When you say net zero, this is actually a balance sheet concept. That means there is a credit side, there is a debit side. Now, what you are saying is that by 2050, not that emissions will become zero. I mean, there is a lot of people who think that when we are saying net zero by 2050, it is zero emissions by 2050. Nothing like that. Your emissions, you are assuming, will continue to rise, which is realistic in a sense. What is not realistic is the other side, that actually you will have the technology to be able to actually capture carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and do something with it. There is, again, still, and this we have been through this debate about the carbon capture and storage. Now they have added a U to it, carbon capture, use, and storage. This technology at that time, 20 years ago, was not feasible. Today also it is not feasible. Where are those carbon sinks going to come from? Where you will take away carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. The ones which actually are realistic possibilities are forests and your oceans. But both of those natural sinks you are actually destroying. So what is this business of net zero? So if we are fighting about, we will not do it by 2050, we will do it by 2070. That's, I think, to me, is quite irrelevant. So I think when we are talking about calling a spade, I think it's extremely important that we should actually show what the reality is. In my opening remarks, I mentioned that probably the best person to address the issue of energy transition is Ajay. I had also, by the way, the privilege of working together with him on the National Solar Mission, if you recall. This was one of the, I should say, one of the success stories that we had. And in that, Ajay played a very, very critical role. So I must acknowledge his role in that respect. That National Solar Mission would not have seen the light of day but for some of the very innovative kind of ideas that he injected into this whole process. So I want to acknowledge that. Now, Ajay, 10 minutes, energy transition.
Thank you. You began by saying that an honest answer to the question posed today would be, frankly, no. You said the latest report says the window of opportunity is closing rapidly. So the situation is actually very bleak. And if we look at whatever has happened in the last 10, 15 years, what has happened in the last 2, 3 years, or what is happening this year, I think the prognosis remains very bleak. So is there a window of hope left? Let me put it like this. Now there are positive signs and developments which I think we need to take note of. The foremost is that in the developed countries, civil society momentum is gaining pace. It's stronger in Europe, but even in the US, we saw for the first time climate change being a part of the election campaign of President Biden and contributing to his victory. The second area which gives some cause of optimism is that technology has moved dramatically, and so have costs moved dramatically. So they have moved in a manner which many of us thought was not possible in our lifetime. You referred to the solar mission. 17 rupees in India is now 2.5 rupees. 10 years, 12 years. So if one looks at the global picture, renewables plus storage have arrived at the point where the electricity system can move to net zero or actual zero without imposing any cost or a cost which the advanced countries can bear very comfortably. So if you look at Germany, they've got 40% electricity from renewables. You look at UK, it's about 35%. In Northwestern Europe, it makes commercial sense to build an artificial island, put wind farms, and treat it as North Sea oil. So 2035 is the objective of California for carbon-free emission. Europe is moving there. Now, given costs and technology, there is no reason why this cannot be pushed back to at least 80% decarbonization of electricity by 2030. If the US puts in enough effort and money, they achieve wonders in a few years, so this is possible. Now, the other major area where technology has moved dramatically is in the area of electric vehicles. So in our own market, two-wheelers, three-wheelers using internal combustion engines will disappear in a few years. So if you have all of surface transport and electricity, and electricity is moving towards decarbonization, you have two trajectories which are moving to zero emission. So if there is a year in which all electricity is carbon-free, all surface transport is on electricity, and all electricity is carbon-free, then you have decarbonized very dramatically, because globally 40% of carbon emissions come from electricity, and transport is about 18% or so. So you're looking at 58%, 58% of carbon emission disappearing with technologies which are already there and proven. So it's only a question of those who are taking decisions agreeing to drive the process. Now, there is some forward movement. Europe has decided no more internal combustion engines will be sold, cars in 2035. UK has 2030. Now, this can be pushed forward. In fact, I believe in G20 we should try and push the developed countries to move forward rather than telling us to move forward, because they can do it. Now, if you cross the electricity and transport sector, then you have very tough areas called hard-to-abate sectors. Now, there, the major portion of it today is, in theory, capable of being made fossil fuel-free by hydrogen. And which is why the whole world is moving on the hydrogen economy very fast. So Germany wants to be number one in the hydrogen economy. Korea wants to be in the top league. China is moving very aggressively. So if the hydrogen economy becomes a reality in this debate, in this decade, then the industrial sectors where electricity cannot be used to substitute fossil fuels will have a large segment which can be made free of fossil fuels in the next 5-10 years. What would remain are a few segments where today technology does not seem to exist where we can eliminate fossil fuels. But that's a very small segment of the global economy or the global carbon emissions. So this is cause for optimism. But where is the real problem? The real problem is within the United States. They remain the global leaders. They will remain so in the foreseeable future. If you look at per capita emissions, which I think is the real measure, they are the largest in the world. There were 14 tons per something equivalent in 2019. They've just come down to 12.98, and they were as high as 20. We are 1.69. Europe was about 6.7, has come down up to dramatically because of wind. And China is 7.06. So the Chinese are the factory of the world. And the US and Europe are the ones who have the highest per capita emission. So the US has to take a deep breath and decide that these per capita emissions could come down to European levels in 4 or 5 years. But there is no political will there. And if in the next election we have a Republican in the White House and a Republican-controlled Congress, which still is the case, we can forget about the survival of mankind. So I think global civil society owes it to mankind to mobilize their friends and relatives in the US and persuade the Republican Party to see the facts. Because if they do not come on board, we can forget about the survival of mankind. Now look at Biden's presidency. He campaigned saying 2035 will be fossil fuel electricity. He's nowhere near doing anything on that because he doesn't have the mandate. So all that he's been able to get through Congress is money. Money for all the good things. But unless you take the harder decision that I will do away with, with reduced carbon emissions through law. Now, US still has 20% of electricity from coal. We are lectured that do away with coal, but they have 20% electricity coming from coal. So I believe that the future of mankind and its survival depends on the rest of the world persuading the US to act rather than lecture. Now, China is the largest emitter. Now, the Chinese are very well positioned in terms of technology to make a transition very rapidly. Right now, they are the leaders in every frontier technology, whether it's solar panels, electric vehicles, batteries, concentrated solar thermal pump storage, you name it. And they are a powerful state. So the day they decide to move rapidly, they can move at a speed which would be amazing. Because, I mean, if you look at solar panels, Germany was the leader globally in manufacturing in 2005. By 2015, the Chinese had taken over the global market and destroyed the German industry. So I believe that the Chinese can make the transition required, provided US moves. And if the two move, movement in the rest of the world is not going to be that difficult. I will end with India, only one comment, that in the latest price discovery of SECI tenders, renewables plus storage is cheaper than new coal. On commercial grounds, therefore, it does not make any sense for India to build any new coal-fired stations. Our 2030 goals are very ambitious. They surprise the world, they surprised us. I think we are today well on track on achieving that, and if we achieve that in 2030, we'll be very well poised to succeed to a degree which today appears difficult. And we are also moving, I think, in the right way in the hydrogen economy. So if on the hydrogen economy we are somewhere on the global frontier at the end of the decade, then from our point of view, we are also well positioned for the energy transition. But I would again end, the US public and Republicans have to be brought on board. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ajay. You did not disappoint us. Of course, I think you have enabled us to end on a somewhat more optimistic note. Perhaps we will not get as fried as we thought we would at the end of the 2030s. I would just like to say that while the technology may be there and the trends may be showing that if there is a will, there is a way. But the record so far has been that the will has been singularly lacking. So I would still say at the end of this session that the jury is still out, and perhaps we need to not just leave it to the US and China, but I think it is important for us to also exercise some degree of agency, because our own destinies are involved. We have
just one point.
Yeah.
I think the political economy in the US is about the fossil fuel companies and their enormous power. And it is this that has to be played out. And carbon capture and storage is a dream they have been selling for 20 years very successfully.
Yeah. This is a dream. I mean, I don't think this is a serious business, but it continues to dangle something attractive in front of all of us. We have to stop at 8:15. So we have literally just about 7 to 8 minutes. So I will take a few questions. I will take 3 questions together, and the panel will try to answer. Yes, please. I'll come to you.
Please make the questions very brief, 20 seconds each.
No comment, please. Only a question.
You're talking about survival versus lifestyle. Well, living in Delhi, it's very much survival. So I would like to know how many years before Delhi no longer becomes the most polluted capital in the world. And why is China so much ahead of India? It is said to be because of not burning agricultural waste. So stubble burning. So such a simple thing like that has not been done. And besides, you talk about electric vehicles. Vehicles contribute only 25% to pollution. So you think electric vehicles will do the job and hydrogen will come in time. It all seems, as far as Delhi goes at least, it seems a total failure.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, please.
My question is that why India adopted a Western form of development, which has already failed in the West. The development didn't work according to the climate change and the problems that we are seeing. Why India adopted that Western form of development, and which has actually benefited. All the development that has happened in India has actually benefited the multinationals and all the big companies in abroad, and not really India has not gained. I've moved to New Zealand 20 years ago. I've come back. I've seen people more unhappy than they were before. So
So
I
what-
want you, why did India not have its own indigenous type of
Strategy
development?
of development. Okay.
Development.
Yes, sir.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the presenters for the really informed present for us. I have the impression that this debate on the climate change is primarily being entertained between the intellectuals and the political arena. And seems to me there is a gap. The ownership downstream to the mass population of the world don't really understand what is going on. Is there any gap of knowledge transmission about this threat that is common to humankind? Thank you.
Just to say that perhaps people at the grassroots level are today much more aware about the impact of climate change than the intellectuals are. Because they are facing this every day, the impact of climate change. As Sunita said, it is no longer something going to happen in the future. It is something which is happening now. So actually people at the grassroots level are very much aware of the challenge that they are facing. On a local basis, yes. On a local basis, but they are also, I think, what is, so one of the encouraging things is that when I was doing climate change work, and when we were working on the National Action Plan on Climate Change, I did visit quite a lot of places within India. And I can tell you that virtually in every nook and corner of India, the kind of innovation that is taking place at the local level is absolutely inspiring. And what you really needed was a national platform where you could pull this together and then make a big impact, because it was whatever impact was being made at the local level.
But Shyam, if I may,
Yeah.
I think your point is very valid, because I think there is a distinction between, if people were really so attuned with what's happening, then you would see more pressure for change. I think what happens, Shyam, is the point that you're making, I'm not disputing it, but it is the farmers of India, it is the poor of India who understand the impact of climate change. It is the middle classes of the world, including people who are sitting on this dais and including all the American and the European and all the other middle classes, however much they may be on the streets. But when you start talking about giving up the car, then even in Germany, there was a huge resistance in terms of the rollback on the internal combustion engine. So I think your point is very valid, because we are addicted to that particular model, and I think that's the point that you made as well. If I may, Shyam, just answer that question on
Please
Delhi.
do. Yeah.
So on Delhi, I think let's not be, I mean, I think Ajay is forcing us to have some hope, so I'm going to follow his cue. But as somebody who's really given more than her life to try and fix the Delhi's air problem, I can tell you we have bent the curve. We have done something. We have shut down coal-based power plants, and I know how tough it was. We did ban coal. We have got BS6 introduced. We did get the expressways built so that the truck traffic, we've got a congestion charge on trucks coming into Delhi. So things were done, and the curve has been bent. But, and I think that's the big but, that we need to understand that time keeps moving, and the number of vehicles on our roads are only growing. The combustion that we have is dirtier and dirtier, and if we don't move with the same determination and take some very tough decision, we're going to be in the same state. The way China cleaned up, and there is a difference between local air and global air, don't confuse the two. What we do to improve PM, NOx and SOx does not mean that you are reducing CO2 emissions as well. But the way China cleaned up was to move to gas, okay? And they moved out of coal. And I think the question today, and that's a question maybe for another debate at some point, is, you know, with the global issues today, with CBAM on the table in Europe, with IRA on the table in the US, the rules of the game are now being changed completely. Whether this is a new form of globalization, it's a new form of localization that we're going to see, or a new form of nationalist, protectionist movement that you're going to see. What does that all mean for the energy security and for gas supply?
Yeah.
Stubble burning we'll talk some other time. I think today
Okay,
is...
I think we'll have to just stop now because we are well beyond our time. It just remains for me to first thank Surinder for once again taking the initiative to organize this very timely debate on a issue that really touches all our lives. This is something that is a continuing conversation, and as Sunita said, maybe this is a cue to you to have yet another debate. And let me thank all my fellow panelists. Each one of them have presented perspectives which are sometimes rare to come by in this country. So thank you very much for sharing your views with us. And thank all of you, India Habitat Center, Ambassador Bhaswati Mukherjee, Sunit Tandon for making this venue available to us to have this debate. Thank you and good night.
Ladies and gentlemen, a big hand to our panelists, the chairman and panelists. We are much wiser about environment than we were when we entered this hall. And after 6 months, everybody says we have to persuade USA. Prime Minister is going there next month. Meera should send some advice.